For over a century, Birmingham has been Britain's beating heart of organised crime, from the Brummagem boys of the 1920s to the Burger Bar boys and Johnson crew of the 2000s. The names changed, the weapons changed, but the violence never did. But this isn't just history. It's an evolution showing the rise, fall, and rebirth of the city's gangland, told through those who lived and died in its shadow. Welcome to Crime Pulse. We've just taken our investigations to TikTok, where every major case drops in episodes. Short, sharp, and easier to follow, one clip at a time. Follow at CrimePulse_official on TikTok. The link's in the description, and start binging the stories behind Britain's hidden underworld. In the 19th century, Birmingham earned the title, the city of 1,000 trades. Unlike Manchester, which revolved almost entirely around cotton goods, Birmingham thrived on a wide range of specialized crafts, producing everything metal, from buttons and buckles to jewelry, steam engines, and even guns. Like many industrial cities across Britain, Birmingham's gangs were fiercely territorial, often taking their names from the areas they controlled. One group was known as the Gun Quarter Gang, named after the district that produced firearms. Others included the White House Gang from Aston, the Garrison Lane 10 Archers, the Bishop Riders, and of course the infamous Peaky Blinders. As the 19th century progressed, Birmingham's population exploded, rising from 74,000 to more than 630,000. The rapid growth brought overcrowding, rows of back-to-back houses, filth, and deep poverty. Street fights between rival gangs became a regular sight, but eventually, the city underwent major redevelopment. Families began moving out of the cramped, decaying center to newly built estates in the suburbs, changing both the city's landscape and its underworld. Early in the 20th century, one of the Birmingham gangs, known as the Brummagem boys, began to spread from the streets of Birmingham to around the country, driven by one lucrative business, horse racing. The English have always had a passion for the sport. Only the wealthy could afford to buy racehorses, to breed them, and to race them, but anyone could afford to bet on them. After the First World War, racecourses were the only legal gambling places, with an annual turnover approaching £500 million. They became the preferred venues for a liberated generation, but the bulging satchels of the bookmakers attracted criminal gangs wanting a piece of the action, and the Brummagems sought the largest share. According to Dick Kirby, a former member of the Met's flying squad and a police historian, the Brummagem boys quickly recognized the huge financial potential at Britain's racecourses. Before the First World War, almost anyone could operate as a bookmaker. There were no real rules or regulations. A bookmaker paid out winnings only if they could afford to. If not, they often hired bodyguards to protect themselves from angry punters demanding their money. Local historian Carl Chin, who has extensively studied racetrack gangs, explains how extortion became common practice. Gang members would approach a bookmaker and say something like, "Hey, you're the bookie, give us 10 bob, for poor old Freddy, he's just come out of Nick." If the bookmaker refused, the threat would quickly escalate. "Come on then, give us 10 bob or else," or more crudely, "If you don't give me £1, I'll turn you upside down." To protect themselves, many bookmakers began hiring tough boxers as enforcers, since brute strength ruled the day. Whether they were bookmakers or ordinary punters, anyone targeted by these gangs faced serious danger. The gang that posed the greatest threat and controlled the most racecourses was the Brummagems. A 1922 police report described them as mostly made up of convicted thieves of the worst type. The gang charged bookmakers as much as 50% of their profits for the privilege of being left unmolested. In turn, some bookmakers used the gang services to dissuade winning punters from pressing their claims for payment. Like many early gangs, the Brummagem boys centered around one strong individual, Billy Kimber, who carried a fearsome reputation. Born in 1892 in Aston, the son of a brass founder, Kimber was handsome, well-built, and charismatic. He became a teenage member of the Peaky Blinders, known for their sharp dress. Kimber soon graduated to the Brummagem boys, the largest gang throughout the 1920s and 30s. Described as a lion of a man, fearless, he reportedly fought only with his fists, not knives, though he was undeniably violent. His charisma enabled him to control his followers. At 18, he was convicted for assault and served time in Birmingham's Winson Green prison. where he met fellow gang member George "Brummy" Sage, who introduced him to racetrack extortion. This union transformed the fortunes of Billy Kimber and the Brummagem boys, turning the gang from a group of ruffians into an organized money-making enterprise. The expanding railway network enabled Kimber's Brummagem boys to travel to race meetings across the country, Doncaster and York, Atoxeter, down to Newbury, and across to Newmarket. They introduced a structured protection racket, replacing the chaotic ad hoc system where rival gangs would show up randomly to intimidate or extort people. For some bookmakers, Kimber's control was almost a relief. They knew exactly what they were paying for, and in return, he kept rival gangs away. Kimber claimed the 5 best pitches at Ascot and Epsom, taking 10 bobs in the pound, meaning for every £50 a bookmaker earned, Kimber pocketed 25. His men also ran smaller rackets on the side, charging half a crown for essentials like a bucket of water, a sponge, or chalk used to wipe the boards clean after each race. For a bookmaker, these charges could reach 10 bob per race. Yet even with these profits, the Brummagem boys weren't satisfied. They set their sights on expanding south, determined to dominate the country's most lucrative racecourses. In the 1920s and 30s, Birmingham's most powerful gang was the Brummagem boys, led by the charismatic and ruthless Billy Kimber. They dominated many of Britain's most lucrative racetracks, traveling nationwide to control meetings and cash-heavy events, especially at Ascot and Epsom. A photograph from 1919 captures them in sharp suits, buttonholes, and boaters, the picture of sophistication. Yet behind the style lay brutality. Hammers, blades, flick knives, cutthroats, bottles, and, when things escalated, revolvers, a formidable arsenal that underpinned their power. In the south, the Brummagem met their match, the Sabinis, a feared Italian crime family led by Charles Darby Sabini. Darby was a former middleweight boxer, always armed with a fully loaded automatic tucked in his back pocket. Alongside him were his brothers, George, Joe, Fred, and Harry Boy Sabini, a formidable family syndicate who commanded their own vast network of bookmakers, racketeers, and enforcers. The Brummagem clashed repeatedly with the Sabinis. A rare photograph shows the two gangs posing together, but the uneasy peace didn't last. Soon it descended into tit-for-tat violence. The feud reached boiling point when Darby Sabini shot at Billy Kimber. Kimber, trying to prevent an all-out gang war, called for a truce and went to meet him. But the peace meeting turned bloody. One of Sabini's most violent men, Alfie Solomon, shot Kimber, leaving him wounded and sprawled outside Sabini's flat with a bullet lodged in his side. Solomon stood trial for attempted murder, but was acquitted after key witnesses, including Kimber himself, conveniently lost their memory, following the unspoken code of silence that kept the police out of gang affairs. Just weeks later, at the Epsom Derby, the feud reignited. The Sabinis attacked one of Kimber's associates with a mallet and a bottle. For Kimber and the Brummagem, this was a line crossed, and their revenge would be swift and brutal. On the opening day of Epsom's 1921 race week, the Birmingham boys planned their retaliation. They left the racecourse early in a carabanc and set up an ambush at Ewell, a few miles along the London road. A decoy car was parked at a turning, waiting for the Sabinis to drive past. When the target vehicle appeared, the Brummagem blocked the road, leapt out, and launched their attack. It was chaos, a scene of pure carnage. Locals screamed as the Birmingham men, armed with guns, hatchets, tore into their victims. Bodies lay sprawled across the road. But in a shocking twist, the Brummagem realized too late they had attacked their own allies. The victims were members of the Leeds gang, who had come down from the north. One Leeds man, hearing footsteps behind him and turning to see a Birmingham thug swinging a hammer, shouted, "You've made a bloomer, we're from Leeds." The Birmingham man stopped, horrified, and replied, "My God, I hope not. If you are, get into the bushes, because there'll be murder done today." By sheer luck, no one was killed, but the message was clear. The racecourse wars between Birmingham and London's Italian mob were spiraling out of control. After their disastrous ambush at Ewell, the Brummagem fled the scene in a bright blue charabanc, hardly the most inconspicuous getaway vehicle. With the police now in pursuit, it didn't take long for Police Sergeant Joseph Dawson to spot the bus parked outside a local pub. Incredibly, the gang of 28 men, having just committed one of the most violent attacks in recent memory, decided to stop for a drink. perhaps from thirst or sheer overconfidence. At the George and Dragon, the Birmingham men sat outside in the pub garden, relaxing after their exertions. When Sergeant Dawson approached and heard they were from Birmingham and noticed their clothes still spattered with blood, he calmly informed them they were under arrest. When all 28 men stood up at once, Dawson quickly drew his revolver and warned, "I shall shoot the first man who tries to escape." The threat worked. The gang froze on the spot. Dawson held them there at gunpoint, tense but unwavering, until flying squad reinforcements arrived to take them into custody. The case against the Brummagem was straightforward. They had fled the scene in a distinctive blue carabanc, then stopped openly at a nearby pub, where they were caught red-handed. 26 of the 28 men stood trial. Their behavior in court was so boisterous and unruly that they had to be shackled, wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle, even chained to one another to keep them under control. They hurled threats at witnesses, court officials, and anyone who dared look their way. In the end, 23 were convicted. Sergeant Dawson was highly commended by the Commissioner of Police and awarded £5, a significant reward at a time when a constable earned around £4 a week. The Brummagem received sentences ranging from 9 months hard labour to 3 years imprisonment, but their downfall was only temporary. Many would return to their old ways soon after release. However, the wave of violence on the racetracks had reached such a dangerous level that the authorities were finally forced to act. Police and racecourse officials launched a nationwide crackdown, determined to drive gangs out of horse racing for good. While the Brummagem were behind bars, the Sabinis maintained firm control of the racetracks, continuing their violent clashes with rival London gangs, but their dominance wouldn't go unchallenged for long. Once the Brummagem were released, they quickly returned to the racecourses, terrorizing bookmakers and reigniting old rivalries. Their resurgence drew the attention of the Home Secretary, who in 1925 declared that decisive action was needed to break the power of the gangs once and for all. Under the command of Chief Inspector Frederick "Nutty" Sharp, the flying squad began targeting race meetings, operating with just 12 officers. Every man had to be tough enough to stand toe-to-toe with the country's most dangerous criminals. Sharp himself was a legend in the force. Having joined the police in 1911, he built a reputation for extraordinary courage. In one famous incident, about 40 of the worst thugs from the Italian mob stormed a racetrack. Sharp walked out alone to confront them, ordering them to leave. When one refused, Sharp knocked him to the ground with a single blow. The rest scattered immediately. The flying squad used vehicles repurposed from the Royal Flying Corps, nicknamed bedsteads, because of their large aerials. They were big, clumsy, and impossible to miss. Once the first gang arrests were made, word quickly spread through the underworld. The mere sight of a bedstead van became enough to deter trouble before it started. By 1932, the government introduced reforms to bring order back to the sport. The National Bookmakers Protection Association was established to ensure fair pitch allocation and to eradicate bookmaker intimidation. Under the new system, only bookmakers approved locally by the BPA and nationally by the Jockey Club could hold a pitch, and those pitches could no longer be sold. This move cut out racketeers like Billy Kimber, who had built empires by claiming and reselling valuable pitches. With the flying squad's crackdown and the new licensing rules, the golden age of the racetrack gangs came to an end. The Brummagem, once the most feared gang in Birmingham and kings of Britain's racetracks, found themselves shadows of their former selves. Their influence had been broken by police crackdowns, the creation of the Bookmakers Protection Association, and the changing face of organized crime in the 1930s. No longer able to dominate the racetracks through violence and intimidation, the gang tried to adapt to the new world. Many members drifted into other ventures, nightclub, protection rackets, and low-level hustles. These places became the new meeting grounds for men who had once ruled Epsom and Ascot, but the energy was gone. The streets had changed, and so had they. Billy Kimber, once charismatic, feared, and untouchable, was feeling the same decline. His empire, built on force and fear, had crumbled under pressure. The Sabinis, his greatest rivals, had outlasted him on the tracks, yet Kimber wasn't ready to disappear quietly. In 1936, he made one last desperate move, orchestrating an attack on Sabini's men at Lewes Racecourse. It was a shadow of his former power. The strike failed to restore his empire, and with police closing in and rivals circling, Kimber realized his time was finished. He fled to America, leaving behind the streets and race courses that had made his name. Kimber's departure didn't end organized crime in Birmingham. It simply pushed it back into the shadows. By the 1970s, Birmingham was changing. Factories closed, unemployment rose, and Caribbean families who'd come as workers now faced discrimination and aggressive policing. When National Front violence escalated, young black men in Handsworth, Aston, and Lozells organized to defend themselves. As the 1980s arrived and crack cocaine flooded Britain's cities, these defense groups evolved into something darker. The violence was about to return, closer to home than ever before. Gang crime in Birmingham has evolved drastically since the days of the Brummagem in the 1920s and 30s, where once gangs fought for dominance over lucrative rackets at racetracks. The city's modern gangs now battle for respect, control, and territory. One of the most infamous and long-running feuds in modern British gang history is between two predominantly black gangs, the Johnson Crew and the Burger Bar Boys. The Johnson Crew takes its name from a cafe on Johnson Street, the group's original meeting spot. Their rivals, the Burger Bar Boys, adopted their name from the fast food outlets that once dotted Birmingham's Lozells district, a symbol of their local roots and street identity. What began as youthful cliques eventually spiraled into organized crime syndicates responsible for some of the most violent episodes in the city's history. The Johnson Crew primarily operate in the northeast of Birmingham, particularly in Aston, while the Burger Bar Boys control the west side. The location has since been redeveloped into offices and apartments, but the name endures as a symbol of the gang's legacy. According to veteran crime reporter, both black and Asian gangs in the city had their roots not in drugs or greed, but in defense and survival. During the 1970s and early 80s, young men in Birmingham's black communities formed vigilante groups in response to racist violence from skinheads and right-wing extremists. It started as protection, but it grew into something much darker. In 1981, racial tensions erupted into the Birmingham riots as years of discrimination and frustration boiled over. Heavy-handed policing and the constant harassment of young black men by officers under sus laws further inflamed the situation. Many of these young men, now organized and battle-hardened from street confrontations, began to realize the power they held. They could challenge authority, even the police. When the right-wing threat began to fade, these same groups did not disband. Their structure, unity, and leadership shifted focus from community defense to criminal enterprise. By the late 1980s and early 90s, as crack cocaine flooded Britain's cities, these former vigilantes evolved into drug trafficking networks. With drugs came money, weapons, and territory. And with that came the fracture that split the community down the middle. The once unified movement divided into two dominant forces, the Johnson Crew and the Burger Bar Boys. Former friends and neighbors now turned on each other as the pursuit of profit, pride, and revenge consumed Birmingham's inner city. By late 2002, Birmingham's uneasy peace between the Johnson Crew and the Burger Bar Boys had begun to unravel. What had started years earlier as a feud over territory and respect had evolved into something darker, a conflict defined by wounded pride, paranoia, and the desperate need to be feared. The fragile truce finally shattered in December 2002 when Johann Martin, a 24-year-old senior figure within the Burger Bar Boys, was gunned down in broad daylight on West Bromwich High Street. Martin was well known on the streets, respected, feared, and to some, untouchable. But in Birmingham's gangland, reputation could turn to target overnight. That day, two female members of a gang affiliated with the Johnson Crew crossed paths with Martin. Accounts later suggested that he had tried it on with them. A casual flirtation, in another world, might have meant nothing. But in the volatile atmosphere of Birmingham's gang culture, it was seen as an insult. Disrespect demanded response. Within that unspoken code of the streets, perception was everything. And losing face was worse than losing money. The women made a phone call. Within minutes, Johnson Crew members were on the move. 15 minutes later, a car rolled up beside Martin's vehicle. Witnesses said the gunmen didn't hesitate. They opened fire at point-blank range, riddling the car with bullets. Johann Martin was killed instantly, slumped behind the wheel, his blood soaking the driver's seat. The shooters sped off before anyone could react. The attack shocked police and the public alike, not just for its brazenness, but because it introduced a new and disturbing twist to Birmingham's gang landscape. This was the first major case in which women had actively participated in setting up a gang execution. In a world traditionally dominated by men, their involvement broke a long-standing taboo and marked a turning point. Behind the scenes, police intelligence units could sense something big brewing. Birmingham's underworld was bracing for retaliation, and both gangs began arming up, stockpiling weapons and recruiting young soldiers eager to make their name. The code of silence thickened. Nobody talked, nobody cooperated, and everyone expected blood to spill. That blood came on the night of January 2nd, 2003. What followed would become one of the most brutal and senseless acts of violence in Birmingham's modern history, and forever cemented the names Johnson Crew and Burger Bar Boys in British criminal history. Competition between Birmingham's gangs forces them to stick to their own turf, which they defend fiercely, not just for money, but for something far more intangible: respect. After the murder of Burger Bar Boy, Johan Martin, his brother Nathan Martin, known on the streets as 23, began plotting revenge against the Johnson Crew. He enlisted Marcus Ellis and Michael Gregory, who helped coordinate the hit. They purchased a pay-as-you-go mobile phone and a red Ford Mondeo from a dealer in Northampton. All they needed was an opportunity. That opportunity arrived in the early hours of January 2nd, 2003. That night, one of the Burger Bar Boys, Sonny Sims, attended a New Year's party at the unisex hair salon in Aston, a regular gathering spot that had hosted the same party for years. Inside, Sims noticed several members of the rival Johnson Crew among the guests. He discreetly relayed their presence via mobile phone to Gregory and the others waiting in the Mondeo. Inside were Ellis, seated in the front passenger seat gripping a 9mm pistol, and Nathan Martin in the rear seat, clutching a MAC-10 submachine gun, a weapon capable of spitting 200 rounds a minute. Guided by Sims's directions, the car stopped within feet of the crowd. Without hesitation, they opened fire. In a split second, 23 empty cartridge cases sprayed from the MAC-10. Charlene Ellis was struck 3 times and died instantly. Letitia Shakespeare was hit 4 times and also died at the scene. Charlene's twin sister, Sophie, their cousin Cheryl Shaw, and friend Leon Harris were all wounded. The gunfire echoed down the street, bursts of automatic fire that sent partygoers screaming and scattering. Witnesses later described the car so close they could see the shape of the gun and the shooter's finger on the trigger. The attackers believed they had made a clean getaway. Within 2 hours, however, police tracked the Mondeo down, burned out 4 miles away, an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. Still, at the crime scene, investigators recovered 37 cartridge cases from 3 separate firearms, the MAC-10, a Spanish llama pistol, and another weapon never found. The attack shocked the nation. It was not just another gang shooting, it was a moment of pure horror. The bodies of 2 teenage girls, innocent bystanders, lay lifeless on a cold Aston street, victims of a feud that had spiraled out of control. For Birmingham, it was a turning point. For Britain, it was a national headline. The following day, Maria Shakespeare, Letitia's mother, was called to identify her daughter's body. She later recalled her daughter's hairpiece slightly askew, her eyes still open, and an unshakable disbelief that her child was gone. What appeared to be an indiscriminate slaughter, police quickly learned, wasn't entirely random. The girls weren't the intended targets. The shooters were aiming for Johnson Crew members standing nearby. But the act revealed a darker shift. Just months earlier, women had become directly involved in Johan Martin's killing, marking a new stage in the gang war. The line between participant and victim blurred. Now, women were no longer off limits. Within gang culture, they became legitimate targets. The MAC-10 was grimly dubbed a unisex weapon, a reflection of how young women were being drawn deeper into gang life, carrying drugs, transporting weapons, and taking risks that left them exposed to exploitation, assault, or death. The murders of Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare stunned Birmingham. For weeks, the community was paralyzed by grief and fear. Yet, even as emotions ran high, witnesses refused to speak. Journalist Ahmad Bassi noted that within 48 hours, everyone on the street knew who was responsible. But fear and loyalty enforced silence. The code of the streets, the same unwritten law that once protected the Brummagems and Sabinas, had evolved, but not disappeared. Breaking it meant death. The investigation that followed would become one of West Midlands Police's largest and most complex operations in modern history. Detectives faced intimidation, vanished witnesses, and false leads, but they persisted, deploying undercover teams, secret recordings, and extensive surveillance. Behind the scenes, expert mediators worked to prevent further retaliation, while police prepared to dismantle the city's most notorious gangs once and for all. The 2003 New Year's Day murders cast a 2-year shadow of silence over Birmingham. Police knew who the 4 gunmen were, but proving it was another matter entirely. Out of nearly 100 people who had attended the party that night, not a single one initially came forward with a written statement, a reflection of the deep mistrust between the community and law enforcement. Investigators spent tens of thousands of man-hours, took over 1,300 statements, and examined 40 vehicles before finally gathering enough evidence to bring the 4 suspects to court. The trial that followed was one of the most tense and dangerous in Birmingham's history. Members of the Burger Bar Boys packed the courtroom, intimidating witnesses, shouting during testimonies, and causing others to refuse to speak altogether. Some witnesses even chose to face contempt of court rather than risk retaliation. Crime reporter Ahmad Bassi, who covered the case extensively, described being followed to his car after court sessions and later needing a police escort for his safety. The fear was real, both inside and outside the courtroom. In an unprecedented move, one Johnson crew member testified anonymously, hidden behind a curtain with his voice electronically distorted. When questioned about his background, he admitted, "I am a member or have been a member of the Johnson crew." He went on to name the shooters, identifying Sims through mobile phone communication on the night of the murders. The defense argued that the testimony of a self-confessed gangster couldn't be trusted, but the jury believed him. In 2005, Mr. Justice Golding convicted Marcus Ellis, Nathan Martin, and Michael Gregory for the murders of Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare, sentencing them to 35 years each, with Rodrigo Sims receiving 27 years. The murders, nearly 70 years after the Brummagem's era, marked a turning point in Birmingham's criminal history. The shocking reality that 2 innocent young women could be gunned down over a feud between former friends forced many gang members to reflect on just how far the violence had gone. Even more disturbing was the revelation that Marcus Ellis, one of the convicted gunmen, was Charlene Ellis's half-brother. Though the two had reconnected only weeks before her death, his loyalty to the gang outweighed any blood ties. In the aftermath, Maria Shakespeare, Letitia's mother, turned her grief into purpose. She began visiting schools across the Midlands, from year 6 to year 10, speaking directly to children about the cost of gang life and the danger of glamorizing violence. Her message was raw and uncompromising. It's hard to get out because once you've seen too much, you become a target yourself. Her campaign became a cornerstone of Birmingham's community response to youth violence. Supported by stronger policing and anti-gang initiatives, firearm offences and murders began to decline sharply after 2005. But the peace has been fragile. While the Johnson crew and Burger Bar Boys no longer operate with their former intensity, decimated by arrests, deaths, and a new generation rejecting the old feuds, splinter groups, younger gangs, and territorial disputes over drug markets prove that while the original faces have changed, the culture of retaliation remains embedded in Birmingham's streets. The story that began with the Brummagem boys has evolved through generations, new faces, new weapons, but an unchanged cycle of respect, revenge, and ruin that continues to haunt Birmingham's streets. But out of tragedy has come resilience. Community voices, grieving mothers, and reformed gang members have fought to rewrite the script, proving that Birmingham's story isn't just one of crime, but also of courage. The legacy of the past still lingers, but the lessons it carries could yet change the city's future. If this tale of underworld tussle gripped you, subscribe to Crime Pulse for more tales of true crime, untold stories, and the fight for justice that shapes our cities. Don't miss our next deep dive into the shadows of history. Hit that subscribe button and join the pulse of truth.